Welcome, everyone. I'm Lori Wise, and it's my privilege to serve as president of the Women of Washington Hebrew and to serve on the board of our temple. What a thrill to see all of you here today together in person. And I want to welcome all of you who are on the live stream. An entire community of Nina Totenberg fans. This size crowd reminds me of the good old days, only we appreciate being together even more post-pandemic. So it's an updated version, perhaps good old days version 2.0. I'll be brief because all of us want to maximize the time we have for Ms. Totenberg's wisdom. First, I have the usual reminder about cell phones and smartwatches. We are so used to this request that when I make it now, I see people nodding and no one checking, and then about 20 minutes later, something rings. So I'm going to ask you, even though you're sure you turned it off, to please double check. Proust famously said, "Let us be grateful to people who make us happy. They are the charming gardeners who make our souls blossom." Having so many of my friends here today certainly makes me happy, makes my soul blossom. In the context of our celebrating the power of friendships, let's welcome newcomers. I'm going to ask you to look to your left, to your right, in front of you and behind you. And if there's anybody that you don't already know, please welcome the newcomers. Introduce yourselves so that when we enter the luncheon together, everyone will have at least one new friend. Okay, those are very enthusiastic introductions. And now, someone who's made me wildly happy. Can you all take your seats, please? Okay. Someone who has made me wildly happy and grateful is Christy Weiss. Christy wears many hats: wife, mother, mother-in-law, soon-to-be grandmother, incredible, successful realtor, member of our Washington Hebrew community, and a friend to many. But the most relevant hat she wears is dear friend of Nina Totenberg. It is thanks to Christy, I don't want to leave anybody out, that we are honored by Nina's presence today. So it is only fitting to ask Christy to introduce her friend. Please do.
Good afternoon, everybody. When I practiced what I was going to say, I did it on my computer propped up, and I don't have a dais, so you'll just have to bear with me. Good afternoon, everyone. Now you know my name is Christy Weiss, and it really is a joy to see all of you. Please come and sit. Looking forward to everyone being together. When Lori Wise invited me to welcome my friend Nina Totenberg to discuss her book, Dinners with Ruth, Rodgers and Hammerstein's iconic work, The Sound of Music, came to mind. Rather than, how do you solve a problem like Maria, I thought, how do you introduce a woman like Nina? Well, we all know her work as a trailblazing, fully invested, sharp-minded, and articulate journalist, winner of every famed award in her field, at least once. She is also a wife, music aficionado. Did you know that her father was a child prodigy violinist? And an educator, Roman Totenberg. And she's a judicial expert, a superb hostess, a foodie, an enthusiastic tennis player, and she has a passion for fashion. Nina is forthright, a connoisseur of life, a devoted friend. She is nice. Nina is a mensch, full stop. It may not surprise you that many of these descriptives also bring to mind Ruth Bader Ginsburg. These two began their friendship 50 years ago in the early 1970s, well before Nina became NPR's celebrated legal affairs correspondent, and Ruth was appointed a Supreme Court justice. Each was early in her career when they met and determined to succeed in the male-dominated fields of journalism and the law. At that time, there were very few professional women role models for them, and it has always seemed to me that they found qualities in one another to fill this gap. They spoke a common language, rooted in being Jewish women with Jewish values. Each possessed the highest integrity and the most determined grit. Each became an expert problem solver, creative problem solver, I might say, and both developed resonant voices, perfecting the art of persuasion. I wonder at how enriching it would have felt in those early years to form such a deep and meaningful friendship, how encouraging it would have been to be recognized and valued professionally as a woman by a kindred spirit whom you so admired. But really, I think they just liked each other. They both loved to shop and to talk. They are no-nonsense gals with a flair for fun, and they had a lot of it. Over time, they came to know that they could trust one another with their hearts. Over 50 years' time, they helped each other through life's most dire challenges and greatest joys. Nina and I met through RBG, and as time unfolded, with the justice's health declining, we found ourselves drawing closer. In those years, we sought comfort in one another as we confided concerns, pain, and thoughts about how to relieve our friends' challenges. We came through having discovered our own friendship, born from a shared Jewish, what happened? Okay. Born from a shared Jewish heritage, a passion for music and for the Ginsbergs. And we found that our husbands really like each other too. Nina and David are a great couple. They are commensurate hosts, welcoming neighbors and friends to their front porch throughout COVID and gathering family and friends, including the Weisses, at their table regularly. David is a gifted chef, much like Marty Ginsberg was, while Nina's signature smile, charismatic, open-armed welcome, unsurpassed knowledge of current events, as well as many contributions to the kitchen production, relaxes every one of her guests, thereby encouraging animated and wide-ranging, captivating conversation. Nina's, I think I've got this wrong, guys. Hang on. No, it's right. Nina's deep and broad bench of professional accomplishment, personal talents, humanity, and devoted friendship merit a much longer introduction, but this is a start. Nina, I am so very pleased to welcome you to Washington Hebrew Congregation. Everyone gathered today is eager to hear your story from your lips. For my part, I want to conclude by thanking you for so many things. First, for your leadership, for paying it forward, by mentoring and becoming a role model for the next generation of women, for trailblazing and for pushing through long-established and formidable boundaries. But it must be said that great leadership requires more than professional achievement. Nina's, whoops, I'm so sorry, everybody, this is annoying. Leaders like you, Nina, whom we aspire to follow, share your full self, your warmth and candor, brio and ability to connect. These ingredients are the bouquet garni that make you even more effective professionally and irresistibly delicious as a friend. Nina Totenberg and Senior Rabbi Shankman, may I invite you to take your seats here on the bima and begin the conversation about dinners with Ruth and the power of friendships. Would you all please join me in welcoming Nina Totenberg?
I turned my phone on because, as you may know,
There are a few things going on.
people may want me.
So we get to be part of those conversations.
If you, I was once at an event sort of like this, and my phone rang, and I said, well, did you post it? I'd filed a story just, before I'd gotten there, and they said, well, we were waiting to hear from you. I said, I told you to post the sucker the minute it happened.
Well, thank you for being here, Nina, and David as well. We're delighted to have both of you, and a huge thank you to Christy Weiss. And we're delighted, and thank you, Mildred Amer, for being here. I know we have a number of, we have a number of our, it's just wonderful to see everybody in the room together. It's been a while since so many of us have been in the room together. I know that we have others joining us on the live stream, and we are delighted that you're with us as well. But this moment is also one of really sisterhood, which is so much of what your book is about, but that idea of friendship. And I want to take a moment, as you know, I'm a rabbi, so I just want to take a moment to ground us in this week's Torah portion, which is a challenging one to ground our conversation in because it's Tazria Mitzora, which is, for those who have not had a child who has had this portion, it's a challenging one sometimes. It's the one that speaks about tzara'at, or leprosy, and not always a fun one to. Some of you are nodding. You remember trying to help your children, or you yourself perhaps, writing a Devar Torah about this. But the reason I want to start with that is because one of the explanations or reasons that's given as why somebody might have been afflicted with leprosy was because of lashon hara, idle gossip or speaking badly about someone. I'm not suggesting you do that at all.
No.
In fact, the opposite. And the importance of words and choosing the words that we do in both of our professions, that's such an important piece in how we speak about somebody. And this, and your book, Dinners with Ruth, which I know many of you have either read or will, is such a loving tribute, not only to that relationship, but also to other friendships, both with women and with men. And so in thinking about even those moments that may be challenging for us with others, how we choose those words. And I know you've made a lifetime of really being intentional with the words you choose, even in the example you just gave us about get the sucker out. I think that there are words that we choose that really have impact. And so I know that in the words we're going to share, both with one another and questions that some of you will ask as well, we'll have the opportunity to create those relationships and those friendships. So thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. The one thing when I wrote this book, which I got sort of dragged into writing, the one thing I wanted to do was to settle no scores. And I think I did that. And it's not always easy because there are people who have done things in your life that you dislike. And I just was not going to write that kind of a book. So if you're looking for that kind of gossip, you won't find it. But if you're looking for good gossip, you will.
So given that, you mentioned you were somewhat dragged into writing this book. Could you tell us a little bit about how you came to write this book?
Well, for years, publishers have been trying to get me to write a book. I have a day job. I do it well. I like doing it well. And I'm a deadline dick. I didn't want to have a huge project. So I kept saying no. And then when Ruth died, I had the people beating a path to my door, and I kept saying no, no, no. And finally, Mindy Marquez, who had been a newspaper executive editor in Florida at the Miami Herald, had just gone to Simon & Schuster. And I said no to her too. And she kept calling me, and she finally said, well, would you talk to the CEO of Simon & Schuster? And I said, well, it would be churlish to say no. There's probably a time in my life where I would have just said no, but it would be impolite. So we set up this Zoom call, and David wandered in as it was beginning, and he sat down, and I said I didn't want to write a book. I had everything I just said. And he said, we'll give you extra help if you need it, and we'll, and I said, I don't need that much extra help, but it doesn't matter even if you do, I still have to write the book. I mean, it has to be my book, not somebody else's book. So, and he said, well, we can make it much easier for you, and we won't give you a deadline, which, by the way, they did the minute I signed the contract. And we won't get, so that if there's a Supreme Court justice drops dead or whatever, and you have to work on it, it's okay. And, everything I raised, he met and overcame. And then I had my ace in the hole. And I said, and I don't know what I would say in a book. And the idea for this book was actually his. It was his idea. And I thought at least that was a manageable thing to do, that I could see myself talking about my life and about Ruth in that kind of a book. And he said, I want a book about the friendships of the people, the women of your generation who really didn't break a glass ceiling, weren't out to do that. You were just out to get a job. And but I had an ace in the hole, and I said, David didn't want me to write a book. He shares my time too much already. And I said, and I had my mouth open to say that. And he says, Nina, I think you should write this book. And if you look at the dedication, you'll see what it says, because I can't remember it exactly. So you'll have to read it.
To my husband, David, who put up with all the late nights of writing this book and then apologized for talking me into it.
So
your friendship with Justice Ginsburg began before you were in the roles that you're currently
in. She was in her mid-30s. I was in my early to mid-20s, and I called her up. She had filed her first Supreme Court brief, and I didn't understand it, and I called her up. I was brand new on the beat, and she gave me an hour-long lecture, and she became my telephone confidant when I needed answers to a lot of things. And then eventually we met at a very boring conference, so boring that we left and went shopping. And believe me, that was really unusual for Ruth. She was not bored by things that I thought were boring, but this one was a real dog.
But not unusual that she would go shopping.
No, and she wasn't a person like I am that would go out to go shopping, but she would shop everywhere she was. So I learned at some point when she was toward the end of her life, and that she was sick, and I was at Neiman's, and I was at the makeup counter, and several of the ladies came over to me and said, please give the justice our regards. And I said, does she, how do you know her? And they said, oh, she goes to the opera here, up in the old Mazda. She goes to the opera, and during the intermission, she comes down and she goes shopping.
So you developed a really beautiful friendship over the years, and not just in the length of time, but the depth of that relationship and friendship. And I'm curious, I know one of the things that you were both very judicious about, pun not intended, but was the fact that you kept while you had those conversations, and she certainly was a resource, you also kept confidence and respected boundaries, which is challenging with a dear friend. Could you talk
It
a little
is,
about that?
but it is challenging, but it's a lot easier with a Supreme Court justice than it is with, let's say, I have a senator friend, because I have no boundaries with them. I'll ask them anything, and they can not tell me if they choose not to tell me. But with her or any other justice, were I to ask about, gee, how's it going with, in the abortion, in the Dobbs case, let's say something like that, they would look at me like I had four heads, and they wouldn't be my friend. Mm-hmm. And I, similarly, can't not ask questions that are perfectly legitimate questions, even if they might be embarrassing. Now, only once did she ever ask me not to ask her a question, and it was after she'd said something impolitic about Trump. And I said, Ruth, I have to ask you. You can tell me to go to hell, but I have to ask you. And she virtually told me to go to hell.
So you've covered the court beat for many, many years. Did you expect that to be a place that you would stay? And if you moved to a different area of reporting, what would it be if you had a second choice?
Well, the thing about covering the court for most of my professional life is it wasn't the only thing I covered. Not by a long shot. I covered major trials. I covered the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. I covered every major scandal that went on. And I covered, and I did investigative reporting, and I covered politics. I covered presidential campaigns and Senate campaigns. But that was a different world when we didn't have news 24/7 on the air, when we didn't have digital, we didn't have podcasts, we didn't have the myriad platforms that we now have. And so I would say starting about 10, maybe a little more years ago, probably 10, I really didn't have the time to do all the things I used to do. And I spend an enormous amount of time even just prepping for, I've already written 3 versions of what the court's going to do. And I've left holes to plug them in and get it posted. And sometimes we beat the wires that way, and that's important to a news organization. And now, that means the 2 versions that I wrote will never see the light of day. So it's a lot of wasted time in some ways. But it is illustrative of the world we live in today.
Could you talk a little bit about the way in which that world has changed and shifted, particularly when it comes to the court and to what you've seen in politics? I know it's something you alluded to in the book, and in thinking even about some of the rituals and traditions surrounding the Supreme Court itself. And with COVID, how some of those may have been impacted, and perhaps some of that not due to COVID itself, but just general changes, and what you see as trends in that area.
Well, the court now has 3 Trump appointees, and it already had 3 other conservative appointees. The fact that Chief Justice Roberts is now the center of the court is illustrative of how far to the right it's moved. And it's I would say, more conservative than any court in about 90 years. So, and it's a pretty activist court too. It wants to do things. It wants to change the law. It thinks that the law in the last 50 years, prior to, let's say, 2010, was way too liberal. And Dobbs is not the only case like that. The court is very aggressive about reining in government regulation and giving agencies power to do things. And some of the things they do are very small, hard to explain, and may not even make the newspaper. If the chairman of an agency is no longer, or if an administrative law judge, these are career people who do a lot of the agency, handle grievances, handle basically litigation. If they're fireable in a way that they weren't fireable before, that's a very significant change. It means whoever's in power, whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, certain kinds of people can be fired and will be fired. It's a court that, we have a huge election law case that I thought they might get rid of when there was a possibility to do that. They're obviously not doing that. This abortion opinion by Judge Kaczmarek is this is off the record, right? Frankly, Looney Tunes. I mean, the very first thing he did was ban mifepristone nationally, saying that the FDA had improperly approved it 23 years ago. And there's a statute of limitations for how long you have to wait, when you can still challenge a drug. And I think it's 6 or 7 years. So that's what the Fifth Circuit, that's the only thing that the Fifth Circuit said, basically, he didn't do right. Almost everything else the Fifth Circuit said he did do right. And as a result, mifepristone is not available for 10 weeks, it's available for 7. It's not available by mail if the Fifth Circuit is upheld. It won't be available by mail. The generic cheap version may not be available. You may have to go to a doctor again 3 times instead of having telemedicine, and the list goes on and on. So that is the case that's sitting on the desk of the Supreme Court asking for a stay to block the lower court ruling while whatever happens unwinds. And apparently they do not agree on that, or we would have already had the answer. So I'm assuming some people may be writing. I'm assuming, my guess is that they'll send it back to the Sixth Circuit, let them give to have a full hearing and briefing, and we probably will get pretty much the same opinion, and then it'll go back to the Supreme Court, and then they will rule on it, and we will have basically Dobbs 2. We'll see what will happen, what that is. And it affects a lot more than abortion. It affects the entire regulatory structure for pharmaceuticals in the United States, which has been one of our prides and joy. And now it's very much hovering in doubt. No court has ever before invalidated an FDA approval of a drug. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, in 2020, when we were in the middle of the pandemic, and the pro-choice folks were trying to get the FDA to ease up on some of its regulations because we were in the middle of a pandemic, there was a judge in Maryland who approved, he let them send a mifepristone through the mail. And the court didn't let him do that, actually. The court said no, the Supreme Court said no. But at an interim moment before they said no, Justice Alito, the author of the Dobbs opinion, wrote that he was just simply amazed that a single judge would think that he could supersede the expert judgment of the FDA.
Ironic.
We'll see if the shoe still fits.
And you also mentioned something, and I may not, because this is not my area of expertise at all, but something having to do with oral arguments and the way in which that culture has changed somewhat, or there's not the same sort of, I don't want to say respect for it, but place for it on the court.
Well, I don't actually know that it's just changed. It was changed by the pandemic and by the personalities there. It's changed in all of the years that I've covered the court. When I first started covering the court, people had a complete argument laid out and they could get through it, and there would be maybe a dozen questions. Once Justice Scalia came, and he was very inquisitive, and other justices became inquisitive, there would be 75 or 80 questions to ask in an hour. Then the pandemic happened, and I would say in those days, justices generally asked the hardest questions of the people they were inclined to agree with, not disagree with. Now it's a little more theater, I think I would say. Not entirely, but somewhat. But the pandemic came, and they didn't want to do it on Zoom because they didn't want to be Zoom bombed, which some courts had been. So they did it via telephone, and that meant they had to do it in order. It also meant that Justice Thomas, for the first time in more than 10 years, actually asked a question. And now he asks questions regularly. He's the most senior member of the court. He's not more senior than the Chief Justice because the chief by virtue of being chief is the most senior, but Clarence Thomas is the longest serving member of the court now, and a very influential member. And so he does ask at least a couple of questions early on in the argument. When they did it, when they couldn't see each other, they limited it allegedly to 3 or 4 minutes per person, and they went back for a second round. But some people took longer, let's just put it that way. And then when they resumed, they started sort of doing it the same way, except of course there were no time limits. So this week, for example, on Tuesday, I went to an argument that was scheduled for 65 minutes. Now, prior to the pandemic, it would have been 65 minutes. It might have been 65 minutes and 30 seconds, but not any longer. And it was 2 hours. The idea of discipline has gone out the window.
So I'm going to bring it back to friendship and some of the relationships, not only with Justice Ginsburg. You had a long-lasting and very deep relationship with her, and I'm curious, wondering how other friends, if other friends ever felt or seemed envious, and how you integrated each other into some of those relationships and larger circles of friends.
No, my friendship with Ruth was really separate from my friendship with Cokie Roberts and Linda Wertheimer and Susan Stamberg and my other colleagues who are journalists. I would never have subjected her to them as a group, although, you know, she married me and David, and Cokie and Linda made the chuppah, and they were standing there holding it up.
Well, and they had to hold it up.
They had to hold it up.
Story about the chuppah.
So the chuppah was a beautiful piece of brocade on these 4 poles, and so my sisters and Cokie and Linda each were holding a pole, and it was on a very slippery surface in the old Ritz, which is now the Westin something or other, right near the Phillips, and it started to slip on this slippery surface. Now, Cokie and Linda always maintained that my sisters did not hold up the poles well enough. I thought that was scapegoating myself. It was a hard thing to do, and the brocade kept dipping down lower and lower on my 6'3", almost hitting the head of my 6'3" husband. And at some point, Ruth said, "And here, under this chuppah, the likes of which we have never seen before."
So could you discuss a little bit the value and qualitative differences in friendships and in women's friendships in particular, and how those change from friendships that you form in your younger years, friendships that you, new friendships over time, friendships at a point in life where dealing with different issues than perhaps when you were younger and starting out?
Well,
also on new friendships.
Yeah,
and
I mean, I made
friendships.
new friendships. All of my most dear friendships have been since I was 25 or 30. I don't have close friendships with my high school friends. I think those were probably, I don't consider them miserable years, but they're not fun. I mean, I wasn't a cheerleader. I could really sing well. And so I did well, you know, in the chorus. I had decent grades, but I wasn't a superstar. And my friends are the friends that I've made since I was probably about 25 or 30. And I add to them all the time. It's very nice to have especially new and younger friends to keep you young. And I always, you know, some of those are former interns. My interns definitely keep me young because I hear people say things that I have no idea what they mean. And I say, what the hell does that mean? At some point in my life, I started hearing people say 24/7, and I thought, what does that mean? I asked my intern. So they grow up and they become, I have one of my former interns is the Secretary of State of Michigan. One of them is the Attorney General of Connecticut. And so and some of them I'm closer to than others, and I see them too as friends. And I met the Weisses through Ruth. Now, it's not that my other friends weren't with Ruth. I mean, we have an anniversary party every year that's for our closest friends, and they are the ones who were at our wedding, or played a role in our wedding in some way or other. And Ruth was there whenever she could be. And there's a story I tell in the book, but it's better told in person, because we were trashing Jimmy Carter. This was basically a journalist and a lawyer, very close lawyer friend of mine, and a doctor who's married to a doctor who's a friend of David. And so we were all trashing Jimmy Carter and doing a very good job of it. And Ruth is sitting far from me we're about 10 people at dinner, and she's sitting next to David, and she goes like this. I dissent. And then she went into chapter and verse about how he had named more women and minorities to the federal bench than anybody before him, and most of them combined.
You reflected on the importance of not just the shopping sprees and the wonderful meals and those conversations, but also the act of showing up and the importance of showing up for one another in a friendship. And I wanted to share something that you wrote that really jumped out to me as potentially the basis of a sermon, perhaps for the high holidays. It might reappear, but about duty. And it was really beautifully, I think you're reflecting on Koki's words. That there is, of course, a lesson in all of this besides friendship and family. It is a lesson that involves a rather old-fashioned word, duty. When you come to a crisis in life, I think you will find that doing your duty will serve you rather well, whether it is your crisis or someone else's. The path is clear, the choice is few, and there are no regrets afterwards. Indeed, there are rewards. You are a better person, for want of a better word, a deeper person, and able to accept life's blessings too. And I know those are words that you were reflecting upon, but it seems as though from everything you shared in all of your different friendships, that duty is an important piece of that.
Well, when you're young, for the most part, fortunately, you don't know of the things that will befall you that are terribly difficult. And I do think they make you ultimately a better person if you have role models about how to be a better person. My first husband fell on the ice and had a terrible head injury and lived for another 5 years, and we managed fairly well, but it was hardly easy, and all of my friends rallied to me, all of them. They would show up, whether it was Ruth or Koki or Linda, they would show up with dinner, and we'd sit around, all of us, with Floyd, and have a wonderful time. And if I needed them, they made very clear, just call. And I would be, when he was in the hospital for the better part of a year, I was just part of the gang, and I never paid for dinner. They never wouldn't let me pay for dinner when he wasn't there, and I think they were role models for me about what I should do for others, and I try to do that. And there are ways and ways to do it. I suddenly realized a few months ago that I had not, Linda Wertheimer is no longer really at NPR almost at all, and that I just don't see her. So I started, and I felt really guilty and badly about it. And I told her that. And so what I started doing is calling her on the way to work once a week, usually Monday or Tuesday. It's about a half-hour drive. And I just call and I say, "It's Nina, checking in." And we gab absolutely all the way. I benefit by it. And thank God, and I don't lose. I mean, this woman has been my friend for 50 years. And she lives, a couple of miles from me. And yes, we still have dinner once every month or two, but that's not enough. It's just not.
One of the things I love about the relationship with Linda, with Cokie Roberts, even the way in which you worked together to lift up Mara Leisen and make sure, and that there wasn't you often hear about women being sometimes competitive. Rather than that, I think it's one of the things that really resonated was the way in which you all lift each other up and continue to do that, both professionally and personally. Can you speak about the importance of women lifting up other women?
Well, I just think it's your duty. It's your duty. You don't. And when we did it, we had a really good reason to do it. First of all, most of us at NPR reporters were women, but our bosses, by and large, in those days were not. And we knew that if we didn't make sure that we stood up for our female colleagues to get promotions that they wanted, that the Old Boys Network was just, it wasn't mean, it was a habit. And when you have a child who can't learn a lesson, you have to break them of the habit. So we broke them of the habit.
Thank you. I want to give an opportunity for others. There may be a few questions out in the congregation or the audience. So if we have time for a few questions from the community, Lori Wise, and I want to thank Lori Wise, our president of our Women of Washington Hebrew congregation, for all that she does, and for right now running around with a microphone.
Probably have time for only 2 questions. Anybody?
You got one right here. You don't have to move.
Let's make sure it's on.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So 2 very different questions, and I'm sorry to leave the idea of friendship. You did a wonderful job speaking about it. Thank you. The first is, do you think Justice Ginsburg should have retired while Obama was still president to have avoided what we have now on the court? And the second is about the unethical behavior of Clarence Thomas. And
Why don't you pick which one you want the answer to, because other people have
Okay.
time.
I knew I didn't have to ask those questions because someone else would, so thank you.
all right, let's start with the first one then, and maybe somebody else will ask the other one.
I'm sure this is a complicated question, because at the time that Obama, as we later found out, she never told me, actually asked her to lunch and said, I think it was 2013 or 14, and he said, if you're going to retire, this is the time to retire. And she was at the top of her game. She was then pretty much the senior liberal on the court. She was writing very important stuff and winning cases people didn't think were winnable. And I think she also very much wanted to retire in 2016 when she thought that Hillary Clinton would be president. And if you try to think back to that time, she was not unique in not foreseeing not only that Hillary Clinton would lose, but that the nominee would be Donald Trump. So she waited and she rolled the dice. And I think she, obviously regretted it later, but she wasn't sick. She was feeling great, and she was, she was not that much older than I am now. And I don't want to retire. So.
And she'd also grown into being an icon. She'd become an icon.
She had become an icon, and she enjoyed that. But her work was what really drove her in the last analysis. And her husband had died, and this was what she had left. And I just think that the last part of this is that I'm not sure, and I think that she was not sure, that that Obama could get somebody confirmed. Remember, there was a filibuster still then. And I think that she probably worried about that too. I never discussed this with her. But I think that's what I think.
Thank you. I think we'll just do one more question because we have to get Nina off to New York City right away. So I apologize for those of you who had
And
more
they're going to
questions.
give me a lunchbox too.
Yes, yes.
I just want to thank you for humanizing such an icon. It is so interesting to hear all of these little tidbits, to think that she went to the makeup counter at Neiman Marcus between the intermission. I love hearing, the humanization. And how did she feel about being such an icon? And I think RBG came from a rapper, and she
Yes.
was such an
Yeah, I
icon. Let me just say, I was fascinated for a long time when you interviewed her at the Library of Congress Book Festival. It was one of the most wonderful interviews I ever heard.
Oh, thank you.
And
It
thank
was
you.
good. It was good. It really was good.
And she had to ask her clerks, didn't she, about who the notorious
Yes,
CIG
yes.
was?
She asked him, what is this all about? If you have not seen the movie RBG, you should see it because you get such a sense of her in it. They really did a wonderful job. She just, so what's your question? Oh, I think she loved it, and she was quite surprised by it, and enjoyed it. And she would always say, I'm towards the end of her life, she would say, I'm 87 years old, and all these people want to have their picture taken with me. However, Ruth was a very shy woman. If you sitting next to her, if you didn't know her, was work. She really was not a chatty Cathy. If I could have a conversation with her about judges or law or her family, that was easy. My husband David was the master at getting her to talk about anything, art, opera, all kinds of things that she knew about, but she didn't bring up. And there was an intimidating aspect of this, of when she would go someplace and be mobbed. And David would be literally her guard sometimes and just say, the justice is trying to eat. Can you wait until she's done? And so I think, she never would have done that herself. She never would have drafted him to do it. But it had its mainly ups and a couple of downs. But I think she really did love it. And it was a very charming thing that happened to her towards the end of her life. Marty was still alive when it started, and he used to tease her all the time about it. There's a story where they went to the theater and they walk in, she gets a standing ovation. And he says, and he leans over and whispers to her, this is a convention of tax lawyers. Because he, of course, was a tax lawyer.
Well, she may have loved being an icon, but she couldn't have loved it any more than we've loved having you here. So please join me in thanking Nina.